Hello everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host Dan, and today I'm going to be doing a video for the upcoming Mercury Cazimi in Virgo, and basically with in mind that we're heading into the solar eclipse in Virgo shortly after, and that there's something about the fact that Virgo is ruled by Mercury, meaning that Mercury is an especially good dignity in Virgo, but Mercury is going through a certain period of death and rebirth, I guess you would say, leading up to the eclipse, and that the eclipse is kind of more of a substantial, heavy-duty transit. Compared Mercury Cazimis happen fairly often. It's when Mercury crosses the path of the sun. Mercury is conjunct the sun. There's something about this when it comes to Mercury. As you can notice here, I'm back in this room where I have a large bookshelf behind me with lots of books, and that I have been considering whether, like, I have an interest in literature and I have interest in philosophy, and whether or not to just focus on that on its own, or whether or not to incorporate that in with astrology. And in this case, I've decided to incorporate some of these books I've been reading in with my astrology, because namely the Virgo solar eclipse is going to be in a opposition to Saturn in Pisces. And when I've been thinking about this thing about the opposition and Saturn and a solar eclipse opposite Saturn, a lot of what has been coming up for me has been the fact that the sun is associated as the archetype of the self, right? And in contrast to that, Saturn is the archetype of the other, right? Like if you are a young child and you're the primary like all children have something which psychologists call primary narcissism, right? In that the child is basically meant to focus on the child's own needs, or that the child is treated by the family as like the focus point of attention, being as when you're a baby, you need all this, you're demanding of all this attention and stuff like that. Whereas the adult, or the senex, or the old person is the other, in contrast to the narcissism of the child. And the mature person is a person who has been able to like grow out of a kind of a childish narcissism and has put those things. So there's a kind of like the maturity process is what to do with the archetype of Saturn, whereas the self-centered narcissism is something of the sun, basically, right? And in this, you have there's this basic relationship between self and other, and which has led me basically to consider Saturn, it's not just Saturn retrograde in Pisces, but perhaps even more so once we get Saturn back into Aries, because once Saturn goes back into Aries, Saturn is going to be in its fall in Aries, because Aries is the sign of Mars, where the sun is exalted, and so there may be a kind of an independent, singular, self-oriented focus. And Saturn is backing up into Pisces and then going back into Aries, and there's this place where Saturn's a kind of like an alien outsider in Aries. It's a place that caters towards this solar dynamic, not to Saturn. And so I was thinking about this solar eclipse with this opposition to Saturn that's going to be happening, and then like next year Saturn's going to be back in Aries or whatever. And with all this in mind, I'm trying to think about what I could use to understand this, and my attention was drawn towards this book, which I actually read. Oh, I've been reading a lot of Byung Chul Han books, and I read this one a while back. It's called The Expulsion of the Other, and I think it's an interesting read, because to keep in mind, first of all, that this book was first published in German in 2016, and then it was translated to English in 2018. And so I maybe it's been, I don't know exactly. I read so many Byung Chul Han books. They're not very big. I kind of lose track of the order in which I read them. But I thought for this video I'm going to take a more of a philosophical approach, if you guys don't mind, and I'm going to read this chapter from Byung Chul Han, and it was contemplating this dynamic of the self and the other, and how this relates to the current political situation we're all in, especially with Donald Trump and these mass deportations and the ICE raids and all this kind of stuff that's happening. It's obviously not a very happy topic, and that this is, this isn't a cheery love and light, new age video. I'm talking about some political theory and some philosophy here, but I think it's relevant to the archetypes. And I don't know, maybe I'll just dive into it, and you'll see where I'm going with this. I should also mention that the chapter title of this is called The Violence of the Global and Terrorism. And the thing about terrorism is that I'm recording this today on September 10th, and that September 11th is tomorrow, and then on September 13th is when we're going to have the Mercury Cazimi. Okay? So this is just leading up to the Mercury Cazimi, leading up to September 11th. Some of these things, it seems to me like it's the right time to get into this. Okay? So I'm going to read from this, and I'm going to comment as I go along. I'll have a sip of tea before I get into it. I should also, before I get into this, there's been a recent announcement that, like, Canada, obviously we have this trade war going on with America, and in order to get around this, there are certain deals being made with the EU, but part of this deal making has been that Canadian mining companies are being swallowed up by multinational corporations, so that the whole mining industry is no longer really tied to nationalism, but is rather, there's this multinational corporate entity which gives itself the right to extract our resources, and that as citizens of a nation, we don't really have much say in this, right? There's this question of who does the land belong to, do the resources belong to, and that if our own mining companies are not even national entities, but now globalized multinational corporations, and that the profits of those, do the profits of these industries go back to making the life for the citizens of this country better, or is it just siphoned off in an extractive exploitation by these globalist corporations, right? So this is as Canadian, and there's also in the United States too, that Japan just bailed out the American steel industry, meaning that American workers get to keep their jobs, but the owners are getting more and more globalized. And of course, I don't think that the Trump regime wants to emphasize this. They kind of want to downplay it, but they're still basically selling out to multinational globalism, even if Trump tries to brand himself as being an anti-globalist, right? And there's some kind of issue here where there was a big thing that happened with the Hyundai plant where they arrested a whole bunch of South Korean people, and it's like, regardless of whether or not these people are working legally or whatever, it's like they're targeting the workers or making it all about a nationalization of a workforce. But if the people who own, the capitalists who own the companies who profit off of it are from multinational corporations, then that it's not really ending this globalism, this neoliberalism. It's just perpetuating it with a shitty version of working class politics, basically, right? That's based around xenophobia and othering, rather than an intelligent understanding of what's going on. So I'm going to read this with some commentary, but I'm just going to read from this chapter from Byung Chul Han. Globalization has an inherent violence that makes everything interchangeable, comparable, and thus the same. Ultimately, this equalization leads to a negation of meaning. Meaning is something incomparable. Yet money creates neither meaning nor identity. The violence of the global as the violence of the same destroys the negativity of the other, the singular, the incomparable, which impairs the circulation of information, communication, and capital. It is precisely where the same encounters the same that the circulation reaches its highest velocity. The violence of the global, which levels out everything into the same and establishes a hell of sameness, produces a destructive counterforce. John Baudrillard has already pointed out that the madness of globalization creates terrorists as madmen. This would mean that the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay corresponds to the asylums and prisons of that repressive disciplinary society which itself produces delinquents and psychopaths. With terrorism, something has happened that points beyond the immediate intention of its actors to systemic fractures. It is not the religious itself that drives people to terrorism, rather it is the resistance of the singular to the violence of the global. A defense against terror that is directed at particular regions and groups of people is therefore a helpless substitute act. Invoking the enemy likewise conceals the true problem, which has a systemic cause. It is the terror of the global that produces terrorism. The violence of the global sweeps away all singularities that do not submit to a universal exchange. Terrorism is the terror of the singular against the terror of the global. Death, which eludes all exchange, is the epitome of the singular. It is the shape of terrorism. It bursts brutally into the system where life is totalized as production and performance. Death is the end of production. The glorification of death by the terrorists in today's health hysteria, which attempts to prolong life as mere life at all costs, are mutually dependent. Al-Qaeda's motto draws attention to this systemic connection: you love life, we love death. Jean Baudrillard refers to the architectural particularity of the Twin Towers, which had already been the target of an Islamic terrorist attack in 1993. Whereas the high-rise buildings of the Rockefeller Center reflect the city and have the sky in their glass and steel fronts, the Twin Towers have no connection to the outside, no connection to the other. The two twin buildings, which resemble each other and reflect each other, form a closed system. Thus the same established itself in a total exclusion of the other. The terrorist attack puts cracks in this global system of sameness. It should also be mentioned that for the astrologically aware, that the terrorist attacks on September 11th were characterized by having a Saturn opposite Pluto transit, right? And that the idea is that with Twin Towers, if you follow Byung Chul Han, what he's saying here is the fact that you've got two towers which look identical, which are very large, in that there's a repetition of each tower being the same, and then the terrorist attacks are like with Saturn and Pluto, there is the return of the repressed, right? As in with similar psychological dynamics to shadow and id, that to the self of America, the Islamic extremist terrorist is the repressed other, who's if in the World Trade Center, a symbol of globalization, a symbol of repetition of the same image as a totalizing force, and then with the other being something that's expelled, cast out, repressed, and the Twin Tower attack being like the return of the repressed. The exile comes back and to express itself by destroying the image that takes itself to be totalizing, if you can see what I'm saying. And so this is, remind you that this was published in 2016, and this is interesting because it's around the time that Donald Trump was first running for president, basically, right? And so in that context, this is almost 10 years old now. Byung Chul Han is talking about nationalism and the rise of this new alt-right. So Byung Chul Han says, Today's reawakening nationalism, the New Right, or the identitarian movement are likewise reflex reactions to the dominance of the global. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the followers of the New Right are not only xenophobic, but also critical of capitalism. Both the national romantic praise of borders and Islamic terrorism follow the same reactive schema in the face of the global. Neoliberalism produces massive injustice at the global level. Exploitation and exclusion are constitutive of it. It sets up a panopticon that identifies those who are hostile or unsuited to the system as undesirable and excludes them. The panopticon serves no discipline while the panopticon serves to discipline people while the panopticon provides security. Neoliberalism even exacerbates social injustice within the zone of Western influence. Ultimately, it abolishes the social market economy. The originator of the term neoliberalism, Alexander Rousseau, had already noted that a society governed entirely by the laws of the neoliberal market would become inhumane and create social fractures. Accordingly, he points out that neoliberalism must be augmented by a politics of vitality, vital politic, that brings about solidarity and community spirit. Without politics of life as a corrective, neoliberalism results in insecure, fear-driven masses that can easily be co-opted by ethno-nationalistic forces. Here, the fear of one's own future turns into xenophobia. Fear for oneself is manifested not only as hatred of strangers, but also as self-hatred. The society of fear and the society of hatred are mutually dependent. Social insecurities coupled with a lack of hope or perspectives also provide fertile soil for terrorist forces. The neoliberal system virtually breeds these only seemingly opposed destructive elements. In reality, the Islamic terrorist and the ethno-nationalist are not enemies, but siblings, for they share the same genealogy. Money is a poor best donor of identity. It can replace identity, however, for money gives its owner at least a feeling of security and calm. Someone who does not even have money, however, has nothing, neither identity nor security. Thus, they are forced into the imaginary. For example, the ethnic perspective, which quickly produces an identity. In so doing, they invent an enemy for themselves, such as Islam. Hence, one builds up immunities via imaginary channels in order to arrive at a meaningful identity. Fear for oneself unconsciously fosters a longing for the enemy. The enemy, even in imaginary form, is a vast supplier of identity. The enemy is our own question as gestalt. For this reason, I must confront him in battle in order to arrive at my own standard, my own bounds, my own gestalt. The imaginary compensates for what it is lacking in reality. Terrorists, likewise, inhabit the imaginary. The global creates imaginary spaces that provoke actual violence. The violence of the global simultaneously weakens the immune defense, which hinders the accelerated global circulation of information and capital. It is precisely in those places where the immune thresholds are very low that capital flows more quickly. Within the currently predominant order of the global, which totalizes the same, there are only really equal others or other equals. Fantasies for others do not awaken at the newly erected border fences. They are speechless. In reality, immigrants and refugees are not others either, nor not strangers that create the feeling of an actual threat of real fear. The threat that exists only in the imaginary realm, immigrants and refugees are seen more as a burden. As possible neighbors, they are objects of resentment and envy, which in contrast to dread, fear, and disgust are not genuine immunological reactions. The xenophobic masses may be against North Africans, but they go to their countries for package tours. For Baudrillard, the violence of the global is carcinogenous carcinomatous. I don't know how to pronounce that. It spreads like cancerous cells through endless proliferation, excrescence, and metastasis. He uses an immunological model to explain the global. All the talk of immunity, antibodies, grafting, and rejection should not surprise anyone. The violence of the global is a viral violence, that of networks and the virtual. Virtuality is viral. What is problematic in this immunological description of interconnection? Immunities restrict the circulation of information and communication. A Facebook like is not an immunological reaction. The violence of the global, as violence of positivity, is post-immunological. Baudrillard overlooks this problem shift, which is constitutive of the digital neoliberal order. Immunities are part of the earthly order. Jenny Holzer's injunction, "protect me from what I want," precisely demonstrates the post-immunological quality of the violence of positivity. Infection, grafting, rejection, antibodies do not explain today's excess of over-communication and over-information. The excess of the same can lead to vomiting, but this is different from a disgust towards the other, the unfamiliar. Disgust is a state of alarm and emergency, an acute crisis of self-assertion in the face of an unassimilable otherness. It is precisely the missing negativity of the other that provokes such symptoms as bulimia, binge watching, or binge eating. They are not viral, rather they stem from the violence of positivity, which eludes any immune defense. Neoliberalism is anything but the endpoint of the Enlightenment. It is not guided by reason, it is precisely its lunacy that produces destructive tensions which erupt in the form of terrorism and nationalism. The freedom which neoliberalism purports to be is an advertisement. Today, the global even appropriates universal values. Thus, freedom itself is exploited. People willingly exploit themselves under the illusion of realizing themselves. It is not the suppression of freedom, but rather its exploitation that maximizes productivity and efficiency. This is the perfidious logic that underlies neoliberalism. In the face of violence of the global, the concern must be to protect the universal from co-option by the global. It is therefore necessary to invent a universal order that also opens up to the singular. The singular, which erupts violently into the system of the global, is not the other who would permit a dialogue. The diabolical nature of terrorism lies in the impossibility of dialogue that characterizes it. The singular would only give up its diabolical nature in a reconciled state in which it remained the distant, different element in midst of the closeness provided. So this is like the basic premise of like the World Trade Center attack or whatever, is that there is a kind of the idea of a free market global society in which the self and the other are basically equal players in the same system, and that the only thing that's recognized in the system is a self that is global and totalizing, and that the idea of disgust, the disgust and the fear and the xenophobia is towards all that which is so other that it evades being integrated into this totalizing, globalizing system, and so that the appearance of the Islamic terrorist is a kind of a return of the repressed, or the thing which is exiled out of the consciousness of the ego, which it becomes a shadow figure which has to be omitted, like you have to pretend that certain people don't exist, or that certain people have to be excluded because they represent something that's so threatening to the structure of what's taken to be what's center or totalizing, right? From here, I go back, it talks about Kant's perpetual peace is nothing other than the state of reconciliation. It rests on universal values that reason provides for itself. According to Kant, peace is also forced by the spirit of trade, which cannot coexist with war, and which will sooner or later take hold of every people. This is actually kind of funny though, because the spirit of trade coexisting with war, it is true. There's a controversial truth that the Americans were apparently supplies to Germany during World War II, if you just have to look into the history of companies like Standard Oil, which had a monopoly on the oil industry before it was broken up into smaller companies like Exxon or Mobil or whatever, there was this big company called Standard Oil, and they supplied chemicals to the Nazis for gas chambers. And as far as I'm aware, I think they also helped provide oil and fuel for in a kind of a way where they weren't taking sides, right? If you were an oil baron and you have all these big naval fleets and all these airplanes that need gas and fuel, you're going to make big bucks by selling oil and gas to whoever needs it. Whereas if you were going to be somehow trade and war actually do go together in this sense, but it's obscured because the idea that if you were really serious about beating the other side, you'd create a trade embargo where you would just, if you don't sell them the oil they need for their warships, then they can't do anything with them, right? Anyways, and then this is a kind of a problem where when your resource industry starts to get taken over by multinational corporations who are going to make money selling your resources to your enemies, basically, right? Then maybe you don't have a control over that, right? And this is all in the name of free trade, right? Free trade means some multinational corporation gets to sell whoever he wants, even so your own resources are going to be extracted to you and sold to the people who want to kill you. Great. Anyways, but it is temporary, not perpetual. It is only the power of money that forces peace for its own purposes. Global trade is a war by other means. However, as Goethe's Faust has already conveyed, what seaman does not take for granted the undivided trinity of war and trade and piracy. What seaman does not take for granted the undivided trinity of war, trade, and piracy? Piracy, okay, so you got war, trade, piracy with the third one, commandeering people's own tools and turning them against them, I suppose. Or acquiring things not by fair trade, you know. The violence of the global produces deaths and refugees in the same way as true world war. The peace forced by the spirit of trade is not only temporary, but also geographically restricted. The zone of affluence, or in the fact the island of affluence as a panopticon, is surrounded by border fences, refugee camps, and theaters of war. Kant presumably failed to recognize the diabolical, indeed reasonless nature of the spirit of trade. His judgment was lenient. He assumed it would bring about a long peace, but this peace is a mere illusion. The spirit of trade's only remaining talent is calculation. It lacks all reason. Hence, a system governed purely by the spirit of trade, the power of money, is itself reasonless. Today's refugee crisis makes it especially clear that the European Union is no more than an economic trading union guided by self-interest. The EU, as a European free trade zone, a treaty community comprising governments and their nation-state interests, is not what Kant would consider a product of reason, a reason-based League of Nations. Only a constitutional community committed to universal values such as human dignity could be considered reason-based. Kant's idea of perpetual peace, brought about by reason, reaches its climax in this call for unconditional hospitality, which would give every person the right to reside in a foreign country. The stranger could stay there without facing any hostility as long as the stranger behaves peacefully where he happens to be. No one, Kant argues, has more of a right to be at a given place on earth than anyone else. Hospitality is not a utopian notion, but rather a mandatory idea of reason. As in the previous articles, we are concerned here with right, not with philanthropy, and in this context, hospitality, a host's conduct to his guest, means the right of a stranger not to be treated in a hostile manner by another upon his arrival on the other's territory. Hospitality is no fantastic or exaggerated conception of right. Rather, it is a necessary supplement to the unwritten code of constitutional and international right for human right in general, and hence the perpetual peace. Only under this condition can one flatter oneself to be continually progressing towards perpetual peace. Hospitality is the highest expression of a universal reason that has come into its own. Reason does not exercise any homogenizing power. Its friendliness enables it to acknowledge the other in its otherness and welcome them, and friendliness means freedom. In addition to reason, the idea of hospitality also displays something universal. For Nietzsche, it is an expression of the overabundant soul. It is capable of harboring all singularities within itself. And let all that is becoming, roaming, searching, fleeing be welcome here. Henceforth, the friendship of hospitality will be my only friendship. Hospitality promises reconciliation. Its ascetic manifestation is beauty. We are always rewarded in the end for our goodwill, our patience, our fair-mindedness, and gentleness with what is strange as it gradually casts off its veil and presents itself as a new and indescribable beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality. The politics of beauty is the politics of hospitality. Xenophobia is hatred and ugly. It is an expression of a lack of universal reason, a sign that society is still in an unreconciled state. How civilized a society is can be judged by its hospitality, in particular, indeed, its friendliness. Reconciliation means friendliness. So I don't know. I don't know if I have much more to say about this, but I thought I would just read that out and include that and take a chance by including it on my astrology channel, because I do think that there's some kind of issue here when it comes to this whole dynamic with the idea. Like I said, if you think about September 11th, the main astrological transit that was associated with that was Saturn opposite Pluto at the time that it happened. And that Saturn-Pluto opposition, there was also a Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the time of the COVID pandemic, right? And there's this idea about Saturn as being like walls and limits and restrictions and these barriers and boundaries and all this kind of stuff. And the idea of this Trump regime trying to expulse everybody that's different in this xenophobic, unfriendly way that is based around disgust towards anything that doesn't fit into this uniform idea of sameness. And yet he's trying to be anti-globalist. Or you see some of these attitudes of Byung Chul Han become perverted into this thing about like being about all about something about standing up for your local tradition by expelling all the refugees or whatever. We want to keep England for the English or whatever, right? Like those kind of attitudes. And if you actually, but it's weird because I feel like there's a certain crowd online that are sort of misappropriating Byung Chul Han stuff and spinning it in emphasizing certain parts of it, and that. But there is a criticism in Byung Chul Han towards neoliberalism, but I think we want to be careful that we don't equate any criticism of neoliberalism with a kind of a populist, this kind of populism that Donald Trump capitalizes on, or this common right-wing populism that basically targets the other as a kind of a scapegoat, or something to be afraid of, or like the idea that the terrorism or whatever, or even not just the terrorism, but the way that they use things like this guy. I hit a link. Somebody posted a link on my channel about some guy who was talking, some guy who's going to give a talk about like the problem about the anti-migrant sentiments, right? And this guy gives a talk and he puts up the face of the guy, this black kid who stabbed some young children in the UK, who caused all these riots and stuff. And of course the guy, you can see this face, a weird expression on his face that emphasizes the fact that this person is other, and he looks different. He has a strange haircut. He's got a strange expression on his face. He's got a weird look in his eyes, and that there's that this is an other that you need to be afraid of, that you need to protect yourself from. He doesn't look like you, and obviously, if he goes around stabbing young children, he doesn't have the same ideals and beliefs. So we need to keep like England for the English, and make, even though this person was it was born in England, it was his parents maybe he wasn't even a migrant himself. It's this kind of idea of the fear of the other, and that using examples of terrorism, that there's some kind of like the terrorism is like the return of the repressed, it's the effort to push it out and make it all just, this it's like the sun, the narcissism of the sun, right? Like this one, a self that doesn't see anything existing outside of it. Like the self is the only point of life. All the others are things which are excluded, and that we can only do business with people who match our self-image. And so that we need to exclude everybody that doesn't match the same image. And then the terrorism that comes as the return of the oppressed is just reinforcing this kind of system, right? But the odd thing about this is that, like, in order for neoliberalism to work, you basically have to, in order for free trade to work, there has to be this kind of like trade right now is being used by America as this way to be like, we are going to put all the neoliberalism is starting to crumble because all the tariffs that Donald Trump is using to do trade war with people is disrupting this smooth flow of goods and commodities and trade, and introducing a walling off. But this is with Canada. This is in the context of being pressured to be the 51st state, as in, it would be so much easier for you if instead of having your own sovereignty, your own government, your own politics, your own identity, it would be so much easier if you were exactly like, not just exactly like us, part of us, right? In the same way that the World Trade Center, the two towers looked identically the same. They're considered just two parts of the same building, right? And that the idea that, like, if you want to get the good benefits of being with us, you have to be consumed, violently cannibalized into our system, so that you don't have any identity, you don't have any sovereignty, you don't have any sort of personal agency or will to self-determination. You just have to be completely bulldozed over and converted into our way of doing things, or else we're going to treat you as if you're an enemy, and we're going to be hostile towards you, right? Well, this is so instead of having, this has created this situation where there's a certain isolationist thing going on in the States, but now Canada is becoming more and more mixed up with the EU, but the EU. The problem is I'm concerned with the most recent developments that the EU is just this free trade in the EU is a pretense to basically sell out the resources that are the basic wealth of the Canada, to sell that out to multinational corporations who may then, for all we know, use the same resources against us for more power and control and domination, basically, right? And I think this is the most important thing to try to communicate leading up to these eclipses, and to understand the historical moment that we're in. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for supporting the channel. Tune in for more.